My beloved friends, let us come together for a moment of quiet recognition, not the recognition of a God afar off, not the recognition of a power to be persuaded, but the recognition of a presence already here, already complete, already functioning as the life within us. Before a single word is spoken, before a single thought is formed, that presence is the activity of our being, and it is in this sacred understanding that we begin to touch the great paradox of prayer. For thousands of years, men and women have prayed. They have knelt beside beds. They have stood in holy temples. They have cried out beneath the stars, and still they have wondered why their prayers seemed unanswered. They prayed for health, yet the body remained weak. They prayed for supply, yet the bills rose and the purse remained thin. They prayed for peace, yet conflict persisted in home and heart alike. And so the world has concluded, sometimes in sorrow, sometimes in bitterness, that God must be withholding something, or that God must be slow to respond. But, my friends, this conclusion arises only because the world has not understood what prayer truly is. Prayer, as it is commonly practiced, begins from a false assumption. It begins with the assumption that there is a God somewhere out there who must be moved, convinced, or awakened to our needs. It assumes that we live at a distance from the divine, that we are separated from the source of health and harmony and abundance, and therefore we must call out across that distance. And because we feel ourselves to be apart, we pray as beggars, and we wonder why our prayers echo back to us without fruit. This is the great paradox. The more fervently we pray from the standpoint of lack, the more we reinforce the very lack we seek to escape. You see, the moment we pray for something, we have already declared that we do not possess it. The moment we pray for healing, we have affirmed the presence of disease. The moment we pray for supply, we have accepted the belief of limitation. And the moment we pray for peace, we have enthroned conflict as a reality. In this way, prayer turns upon us, not because God refuses to answer, but because the very consciousness from which we pray is creating the barrier. Let us understand this deeply. God does not answer the prayer of separation, not because God rejects it, but because God knows nothing of separation. The divine presence does not look upon us from afar, waiting for permission to act. The divine presence is the life of our life. It is the breath within the breath. It is the substance of mind, the activity of being, the fullness and completeness of our true identity. There is nothing for God to give us because God has already given all. There is nothing for God to repair because in spiritual reality nothing has been broken. There is nothing for God to restore because perfection has never been absent. And so, when we come to God pleading for what already exists, we come in blindness. We come not with faith, but with fear. We come not in recognition, but in ignorance of the truth. And the heavens cannot respond to ignorance, not because of judgment, but because the law of consciousness is unchangeable. We can experience only what we are conscious of. If we are conscious of lack, lack appears. If we are conscious of illness, illness holds our attention. If we are conscious of fear, fear becomes our reality. Therefore, the great paradox is this. The prayer that is most filled with words is often the prayer that carries the least spiritual power. The heart that cries out the loudest is often the one farthest from hearing the still, small voice within. Now, understand me. This is not a condemnation of human longing. Every cry of the heart is genuine. Every tear is sincere. But it is not sincerity alone that reveals God. It is awareness. Awareness of truth. Awareness of oneness. Awareness that there is no separation to bridge, no distance to cross, no external God to summon. Prayer, in its true nature, is not an attempt to bring God to us. Prayer is the quiet recognition that God is already here, already whole, already complete, already expressing its perfection as our being. This is the introduction to the great mystery we will explore together. Why prayers spoken in fear are fruitless, and why prayers grounded in recognition are always fulfilled. For the moment we stop praying as one who is lacking and begin resting as one who is complete in God, that moment the infinite begins to reveal itself in visible ways. Let us hold this lightly for now, just the faint recognition that perhaps we have been praying in the wrong direction, not upward, but outward, not toward God, but away from the God already present at the center of our being. And as we continue this journey, we shall discover that the very thing we have been seeking through prayer is the thing we have never been without. Let this understanding open the way for what comes next. My friends, as we move more deeply into this work, let us approach the heart of the matter with great humility. For the errors we uncover now are not the mistakes of bad people, but the innocent misunderstandings of those who have sincerely sought the face of God, yet have been taught to look in the wrong direction. And so we must handle this teaching gently, with compassion for ourselves and for the world, as we unveil the false foundation upon which most human prayer has been built. Let us begin with a simple observation. The vast majority of prayers arise from a sense of lack, a sense that something essential is missing, a sense that life has turned against us, and that unless God intervenes, we shall not survive. This sense of lack may appear as sickness in the body, as fear in the mind, as conflict in the home, or as insufficiency in finances. But regardless of its form, the foundation is the same, a deep conviction that we stand apart from the source of good, and it is this conviction, this belief in separation, that forms the root of all unanswered prayer. When one believes themselves to be separate from God, prayer becomes an attempt to overcome that separation. We plead, "God, come to me," we beg. "God, help me," we cry. "God, change this condition." But do you see the premise upon which all of these prayers are built? That God is somewhere else? That God is not already present? That God must be summoned as though he were reluctant or distant? My dear friends, nothing could be further from the truth. Goldsmith taught, and the mystics of all ages have affirmed, that God is not a distant deity responding to requests. God is the very life of your life, the breath you breathe, the consciousness through which you see. There is no moment and no place in which God is not. But so long as you believe in separation, you will pray as though God must be brought into a situation rather than recognized within it. Now let us look honestly at what this false foundation does within our consciousness. When you pray for health, you have already agreed that disease is real. When you pray for supply, you have already accepted lack as a fact. When you pray for peace, you have acknowledged conflict as a power. The moment you pray from the standpoint of need, you have given need authority. And the moment you give need authority, you cannot escape the experience of it. This is why Jesus taught, "Take no thought." He was not indifferent to human suffering. He was simply pointing to the spiritual truth that the moment you take thought for a condition, whether it be the desire to achieve or the fear of losing, you have slipped back into the belief that your life is separated from God. The false foundation of human prayer is not that it asks for too much, but that it asks for anything at all. For in asking, we affirm lack, and in affirming lack, we bind ourselves to the very experience from which we wish to be free. Let us examine this gently. When a man prays for money, is he not silently saying, "I am without"? When a woman prays for healing, is she not inwardly declaring, "I am broken"? When a parent prays for safety, is he not affirming, "Danger has power over us"? This hidden belief is what blocks the inflow of spiritual realization, not because God withholds, but because consciousness can only express what it acknowledges as true. If you acknowledge lack, lack is what appears. If you acknowledge separation, separation is what you feel. If you acknowledge fear, fear is what governs your perception. But understand this deeply. These conditions have no power of their own. They are shadows cast by the belief in separation. They are illusions born from the false assumption that you stand outside the kingdom of God looking in. The moment that belief dissolves, the illusion dissolves with it. This is why Goldsmith insisted that all spiritual work begins with the correction of consciousness, not the correction of the body, not the correction of finances, not the correction of circumstances, but the correction of the inner belief that created those appearances in the first place. If your consciousness begins from separation, you can pray 1,000 prayers, and they will all be echoes of the same illusion. But if your consciousness begins from oneness, a single moment of recognition will accomplish more than years of pleading. And so we are invited now to cross a threshold, to let go of the belief that prayer is a request made from earth to heaven, and to discover that true prayer is the silent awareness of heaven already present on earth. Let us proceed with this understanding as our foundation, for only then can we approach the real meaning and power of prayer. My friends, let us now come into a deeper atmosphere of stillness, for what we are about to contemplate is not a doctrine, not a theological statement, not a mystical riddle. It is the spiritual foundation upon which Jesus built his entire ministry, and it is the very truth Joel Goldsmith dedicated his life to revealing. I and the Father are one. These 7 words contain the whole secret of answered prayer, the essence of Christ consciousness, and the very heart of spiritual liberation. Yet through the centuries they have been recited but not realized, repeated but not understood. When Jesus spoke these words, he was not placing himself above humanity, nor was he claiming an exclusive relationship with God. He was stating the eternal truth about the true identity of every man, every woman, every soul that has ever lived. He was unveiling the spiritual fact that God is not external to us. God is the source, the substance, the life, the breath, the very consciousness in which we exist. I and the Father are one does not mean that the human Jesus was one with God. It means that the divine life expressing as Jesus was inseparable from its source, and the same divine life expresses as you. This principle is the cornerstone of all spiritual healing, all spiritual supply, all spiritual harmony. For if God and man are one, then there is no separation to bridge, no distance to overcome, no request to make. All that God is, man already embodies. All that God has, man already expresses. All that God knows, man already reflects. There is no prayer that can bring God closer than this oneness. There is no meditation that can unite what has never been divided. There is no ritual that can merge what has always been one life. You see, the moment prayer begins with the assumption that God must come to you, you have already denied oneness. You have already placed yourself outside the infinite, outside the kingdom, outside the very fullness that is your own being. And in that single innocent act of believing yourself separate, you create the experience of separation. But once you know that I and the Father are one, prayer becomes something entirely different. Prayer becomes recognition, not request. Prayer becomes awareness, not asking. Prayer becomes resting in the truth, not reaching for a blessing. Let us examine what this means in practical terms. When Jesus healed, he did not ask God to heal. He recognized the perfection of God already functioning as the truth of the individual before him. When he multiplied loaves, he did not ask God for more food. He acknowledged the infinite supply already present in consciousness. When he stilled the storm, he did not plead with God to calm the winds. He rested in the awareness of one presence, one power, one law governing all. Every miracle Jesus performed was simply the effortless expression of the consciousness of oneness. And, my friends, when we glimpse even the faintest measure of this same consciousness, of the same principles operate in our experience, we are not asked to imitate Jesus' works through technique. We are invited to share in his consciousness through realization. For when he said, "The works that I do ye shall do also," he was not speaking to human personality. He was speaking to the divine identity within each of us. I and the Father are one means there is no God separate from your being. There is no life separate from divine life. There is no mind separate from divine mind. There is no supply separate from divine substance. There is no health separate from divine wholeness. All that appears as your existence is actually the activity of God expressing itself as you, and the more you recognize this truth, the more your human experience yields to the spiritual reality that has always been present. Now, understand this clearly. Oneness cannot be achieved. It cannot be improved. It cannot be strengthened. It cannot be lost. It can only be recognized or ignored. It is the eternal, unchanging truth of your being. When you pray from the standpoint of separation, you are ignoring it. When you pray from the standpoint of oneness, you are recognizing it. This is why so many prayers go unanswered, not because God is unwilling, but because the prayer denies the very truth through which the answer can be revealed. Jesus lived from a state of consciousness in which the Father was not a far-off deity, but the very essence of his being. He lived from the awareness that God was the life within the illness, the substance behind the seeming lack, the peace beneath the storm, the light within every person he met. And as this awareness filled his consciousness, harmony manifested effortlessly. This, my friends, is the spiritual principle we must now embrace, not as an inspirational idea, not as a theological belief, but as a living, breathing, moment-by-moment recognition. The presence that breathed through Jesus breathes through you. The life that animated Jesus animates you. The Father that guided Jesus is the selfhood of your own being. As we proceed, we shall see how this realization, this awareness of oneness, becomes the very foundation of effective prayer, and the reason recognition succeeds where petition fails. Let us hold this truth close. Oneness is not something to attain. It is something to awaken to. Everything that follows in this teaching rests upon this one spiritual principle. My beloved friends, now that we have laid the foundation of oneness, let us take a clear and gentle step into the heart of spiritual practice. For many years, perhaps for lifetimes, we have approached God with petitions, earnest, sincere, heartfelt cries for help. And yet there comes a time in our spiritual journey when we must look honestly at the fruit of such prayers. We must ask ourselves, if petition were the true way, why do so few petitions bear the fruit of peace, healing, supply, and harmony? The answer, my friends, is simple. Petition begins with a lie, and recognition begins with truth. When you petition God, you declare, sometimes silently, sometimes in your deepest fear, I lack. You may not speak those words, but you feel them. I need healing. I need money. I need direction. I need protection. And behind these thoughts is an even deeper belief. I am separate from the source that could provide these things. Petition is built upon the assumption that something is missing, but recognition, true prayer, begins from the awareness that nothing is missing in God. And therefore nothing can truly be missing in the life that is one with God. Let us unfold this with clarity. When you pray for healing, you are acknowledging illness as power. When you pray for supply, you are acknowledging lack as reality. When you pray for peace, you affirm conflict as a genuine force. When you pray for safety, you declare danger has authority over your life. Petition is the subtle and sometimes not subtle confession that the appearance is real and that God must somehow come and undo what exists. But, my friends, God is not in the business of undoing illusions. God is not in the business of fighting conditions. God is not even in the business of changing the world. God is the presence of what eternally is. And what eternally is cannot be altered by appearances. Therefore, when you petition, you bind yourself to the appearance because your consciousness is fixed on it. Whatever you accept as real in consciousness must appear as your experience. This is why petition fails, not because God refuses to answer, but because the prayer itself is anchored in a belief that denies the spiritual truth. Now let us look at recognition. Recognition is not asking. Recognition is not persuading. Recognition is not wishing or hoping. Recognition is simply the silent awareness that God already is. Recognition says, there is no disease in God, and I and the Father are one. There is no lack in God, and I and the Father are one. There is no conflict in God, and I and the Father are one. There is no danger in God, and I and the Father are one. The moment you recognize the truth, the appearance begins to lose its power, not because God changed it, but because your consciousness ceased giving it authority. Petition attempts to change outer conditions. Recognition transforms inner awareness, and outer conditions follow. Jesus did not petition. Not once do we find him saying, Father, please heal this man. Or, Father, please multiply this food. Or, Father, please calm this storm. Jesus did not ask God to intervene because he lived in the realization that God was already the only activity present. He lifted his eyes, not physically, but spiritually, into the awareness of God as all in all. And in that consciousness, disease had no reality, lack had no reality, discord had no reality, danger had no reality, They had no spiritual law to support them, no presence to sustain them, no substance from which to draw. Therefore, when Jesus recognized the truth, the appearance dissolved not by power, but by light. A shadow cannot survive when a lamp is lit. Likewise, a discordant appearance cannot survive when truth is recognized. This is why recognition succeeds. It aligns consciousness with reality, and the illusion has nothing to cling to. My friends, do not mistake this for mental magic, for positive thinking, or for the manipulation of thought. Recognition is not an attempt to change the outer world, but a resting in the inner truth. There is no force in recognition. There is no strain. There is no effort. It is simply the realization that God is. And because God is, the appearance has no true law behind it. When you recognize the truth, you do not change the world. You simply stop believing the world's false testimony. And the moment you stop believing it, it begins to fade. This is why Goldsmith called recognition the secret of spiritual demonstration. It is not supernatural. It is not miraculous. It is the natural outflow of a consciousness that no longer accepts lack, illness, or fear as real powers. In recognition, we do not speak to God, we listen. We do not request, we receive. We do not plead, we rest. We do not strive, we surrender. And in the quietness of that surrender, God reveals the wholeness that has always been present. Let us hold this in deep humility. Petition is the cry of a mind that believes in separation. Recognition is the song of a soul that knows its oneness with the infinite. Now, my beloved friends, as we continue into the next part of this teaching, we shall discover how this recognition is entered, not through effort, but through silence, not through words, but through awareness, not through seeking, but through resting in the presence that has never left us. My beloved friends, now we come to a sacred threshold, one that cannot be crossed through thought, nor through emotion, nor through the effort of the human mind. We come to the doorway of silence, the only true sanctuary in which prayer is fulfilled. For all that we have discussed thus far leads us inevitably to this one simple truth. God is revealed only in silence, not in words, not in petitions, not in the movement of thought, but in the stillness that lies beneath thought. You see, the mind that prays with many words is the same mind that believes itself separate. The mind that repeats affirmations is often the mind that secretly fears the very opposite. The mind that argues, that declares, that insists, that demands even in spiritual language has not yet yielded to the presence. And so Joel Goldsmith taught again and again that the highest form of prayer is not speaking to God, but listening for God. Let us understand this deeply. The silence we seek is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of fear. It is the absence of desire. It is the absence of effort. It is the absence of personal will. It is the inner stillness in which we no longer try to get God to do something, for in truth, there is nothing for God to do. God has already done all. Creation is complete. Wholeness is complete. Supply is complete. Life is complete. Love is complete. Peace is complete. And prayer, in its highest form, is the quiet recognition of this completion. When you enter the silence, you enter the state of consciousness where God is not a promise but a presence, not a future hope but a living reality. And it is for this reason that silence is the only place where healing occurs, the only place where supply is revealed, the only place where harmony is restored. Now let me speak plainly. The silence we speak of is not something you create. You cannot force yourself into it. You cannot strain your way into it. You cannot will it into existence. Silence is not produced by the mind. It is revealed when the mind becomes still. Picture, if you will, a pool of water. As long as the surface is agitated, you cannot see clearly. But when the waters settle, what was always there becomes visible. The sky reflects. The trees reflect. The depths become visible. Nothing new has entered the pool. The agitation simply ceased long enough for reality to reveal itself. So it is with the silence. God is not revealed because you reach a certain level of holiness or effort. God is revealed because you stop obscuring what is already present. This is why Jesus would so often withdraw to the mountain or to the garden, not to cry out, not to argue, not to wrestle with conditions, but to return to silence, to return to the awareness of oneness, to rest in the presence that performs all works. And this, my friends, is the invitation given to you. When a problem appears, no matter how urgent, how frightening, how demanding, and your instinct feels, your first impulse must become stillness. Do not rush to affirmations. Do not rush to inner arguments. Do not rush to mental declarations. Simply stop, withdraw inward. Be still, not to make something happen, not to use truth as a tool, but to let truth reveal itself. For in the silence, something extraordinary occurs. You begin to feel, not merely understand, but feel that the presence within you is functioning, it is doing the work, it is revealing the answer, it is establishing harmony, it is dissolving the false appearance, it is bringing to light what was already complete. This is why Joel Goldsmith would say, "Stand still long enough, and you will witness the activity of God. You do not cause the activity. You allow it. You consent to it by ceasing to resist it. In this silence, something within you relaxes. The anxious desire to fix the condition melts. The fear of the appearance weakens. The belief in separation softens. And as these dissolve, consciousness shifts. And when consciousness shifts, the outer world follows. This is not magic. This is not metaphysics used incorrectly to manipulate form. This is simply the nature of spiritual law. When the mind becomes still, God becomes visible. The silence, then, is not a technique. It is not meditation in the common sense. It is not breathing exercises or concentration. It is the inner resting in the truth that I and the Father are one. God is the life of my life. God is the essence of my being. God is the fulfillment of every need already, eternally, invisibly present. And when you sit in this silence, not for results, but for realization, you enter the state in which answered prayer becomes inevitable. For in silence, you cease to ask. In silence, you cease to desire. In silence, you cease to fear. In silence, you cease to interfere. And when all that ceases, only God remains. That is prayer, that is healing, that is Christ consciousness. And that is the only place where spiritual demonstration begins. As we go forward, we shall see how this silence becomes the very foundation of handling the practical challenges of human experience. Those moments of illness, lack, conflict, and fear that so often compel us to seek God. But now we know we do not seek God to change the outer condition. We enter silence so that truth may reveal the inner reality already here. Let us hold this close to heart before we proceed. My beloved friends, having entered the silence and touched even faintly the awareness that God is the only presence and the only power, we now turn gently toward the practical side of this teaching, not to descend into material belief again, but to see how spiritual awareness touches the everyday experiences of human life. For though we speak of God as infinite, though we rest in the understanding of oneness, we do not deny that on the human level there appear to be problems. Bills arrive, the body suffers pain, relationships fall into discord. These experiences feel real, heavy, urgent, and the temptation is strong, very strong, to fall back into petition, to call out, God, fix this. But now we know that God does not fix appearances, God reveals reality. And so, when human need arises, our work is not to change the outer condition, but to change our consciousness about it. We handle the appearance from a higher standpoint, not by force, but by recognition. Let us consider 3 common areas of struggle: finances, health, and relationships, and see how prayer functions in each, not as asking, but as spiritual realization. Financial fear, seeing supply as spirit, not matter. When a financial crisis appears, the instinctive reaction is fear. The mind leaps into calculation. Where will the money come from? Who can help me? What if I fail? And without realizing it, you have accepted 2 lies. First, that supply is material. Second, that supply can be absent. But supply, my friends, is not money. Supply is not employment. Supply is not circumstance. Supply is the infinite activity of God expressing as your life. When you face a financial need, do not pray for money. Do not pray for doors to open. Do not pray for opportunities. Go inward into the silence and recognize God is the source and substance of all supply, and God is the life of my life. There is no separation between me and infinite abundance. I am not a vessel waiting to be filled. I am an expression through which infinite supply flows. You do not pray to attract supply. You rest in the truth that supply already exists in consciousness. And as you rest, fear begins to dissolve. Ideas begin to come. Opportunities appear naturally, not forced, not manipulated, because once fear leaves, clarity returns, and the divine activity of your being becomes visible. The bills may still be on the table, but the fear behind them begins to thin, and that thinning is the beginning of demonstration. Physical illness, seeing the spiritual body behind the appearance. Illness may be the most frightening of all human conditions because it threatens the very sense of life itself, and the instinct again is to cry out, God, heal me, remove this pain. But this is petition, and petition accepts the illness as a power. Joel Goldsmith taught something far deeper. God does not heal the body because God knows nothing of a sick body. God reveals the spiritual body that has never been touched by discord. When illness appears, the spiritual practice is not to force healing. It is to withdraw from the belief that the body is material, separate, vulnerable, in silence. One begins to feel, perhaps faintly at first, that life is not in flesh. Life is the activity of God. The body is the temple of that life. an instrument through which divine harmony expresses. You rest with this truth, not to change the condition, but to recognize the reality behind it. If God is my life, then my life is whole. If God is my being, then my being is perfect. If God is the substance of my body, then my body is spiritual and cannot be harmed. The symptoms may persist for a time, but you no longer give them authority. Your fear begins to relax. Your inner certainty grows, and gradually, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, the outer appearance yields to the truth. Healing is not the result of spiritual force, but of spiritual recognition, relationship harmony, seeing the Christ where the human ego appears. Now let us look at relationships where misunderstanding, resentment, and woundedness often take root. When conflict arises, the human self wants to change the other person. It wants to justify its own position. It wants to be right. But spiritual harmony begins the moment you cease seeing the other as a separate self and begin recognizing the same divine life expressing as them, not their personality, not their actions, but their true identity. In silence, you pause and acknowledge the Christ is the reality of both of us. Love is the truth of this relationship. There is no other to forgive, no self to defend. There is only God expressing as all. Do not attempt to fix the relationship on the human level first. Do not argue, analyze, or rehearse grievances. Go into silence. Recognize the divine identity behind the appearance. As you do, your tone shifts, your reactions soften. Your speech becomes calm. Your presence becomes healing. You will find that the atmosphere changes, not because you change the other person, but because you recognize the truth that governs both of you. And this recognition does what argument never can. It dissolves the illusion of separation, the common thread in all need. Whether the need is financial, physical, or relational, the pattern of spiritual practice remains the same. Do not attempt to change the outer appearance. Enter silence. Recognize the spiritual truth already complete, already present. Let fear dissolve in the light of recognition. Watch as outer form adjusts to inner realization. Prayer in times of need is not battle. It is not effort. It is not pleading. It is not mental force. Prayer is the quiet resting in the truth that God is the only life, the only law, the only substance, the only presence, the only power, and that this God is expressing itself as your very being. This is the practical application of prayer, not as petition, but as recognition. And as recognition deepens, need begins to lose its urgency. Fear loses its grip. Conditions lose their authority. And we discover, sometimes to our astonishment, that the very thing we were seeking was present all along. Now, my beloved friends, with this foundation laid, we move to a spiritual truth still deeper, one that touches the core of all healing and all transformation, the yielding of the personal self, the dissolving of the sense of me, the recognition that God alone is the actor in every demonstration. My beloved friends, we have now walked together far enough along this path that a deeper revelation is ready to unfold, one that quietly stands at the doorway of all true spiritual demonstration. It is the realization that prayer begins to work only at the moment when you stop working, when the personal self yields, God takes over. And until that yielding occurs, even the most sincere praying cannot bring forth the fruit of divine grace Let us look closely at this, for it may be the subtlest and most important truth we touch in this entire teaching. The great barrier to answered prayer is not God's reluctance, it is not fate, it is not karma, it is not the intensity of your desire. The great barrier is the persistent belief in a personal self that must accomplish something, solve something, fix something, improve something, heal something, manifest something, protect something. As long as this self is engaged in effort, prayer cannot function. For prayer is not the activity of a human mind reaching toward God, it is the activity of God revealing itself within a still mind. And so the moment prayer truly begins is the moment the sense of I ceases to act. This yielding is not dramatic, it is not emotional, it is not accompanied by any outer sign. It is a quiet, almost imperceptible inner shift in which the burden moves away from the personal self and into the hands of the infinite. In this instant, something within you sighs in relief, not because the outer situation has changed, but because the false sense of responsibility has dropped away. You no longer feel that you must bring about healing, you must generate supply, you must restore harmony, you must correct the circumstance. The personal I, the one who fears, strives, and struggles, begins to dissolve, and in that dissolution, grace enters. Goldsmith often said, "All demonstration is the activity of God, and God does not share its work with another." So long as you are attempting to do, God cannot. So long as you are attempting to control, God cannot. So long as you are attempting to fix, God cannot. This is not because God is unwilling. It is because the belief in personal responsibility blocks the recognition of divine activity. Let us uncover how this works. When the personal self is active, consciousness is centered on the problem. I must solve this. I must change this. I must get rid of this. I must protect myself. I must improve my condition. This I, my friends, is the very obstruction. It is not the real self. It is the false sense of identity that arises from the belief in separation. And as long as this false sense of self is operating, it obscures the presence that is already functioning. But there comes a moment, often in deep silence, often after the exhaustion of all personal effort, when the inner voice whispers, I do not have to do this. God is already doing it. And in that sacred instant, something shifts. You surrender, not to defeat, not to resignation, but to reality. You stop striving. You stop resisting. You stop begging. You stop interfering. You yield. And the moment you yield, the presence that has always been within you begins to reveal itself. Not in thunder, not in drama, but in a quiet sense of assurance, a peace that is not of this world, a soft certainty that says it is already done, a confidence without effort, without proof, without outer evidence. This is the moment prayer begins to work. Not when you speak, not when you affirm, not when you desire, but when the false sense of me steps aside. Yielding is not weakness. Yielding is the dissolution of the illusion that you live life as a separate entity. Consider the ocean. Each wave believes at first that it exists on its own. It rises proudly, crashes loudly, tries to shape its destiny. But the moment the wave loosens its identity as a separate wave and yields to the ocean, it discovers it was never anything but the ocean in expression, and in that yielding, its power becomes infinite because it is now the power of the whole. So it is with you. When you yield, you do not disappear. The false sense of self disappears, and the real self, the God being, the Christ identity shines forth, handling every detail through divine intelligence. This is why healings occur. This is why supply appears. This is why harmony is restored. It is never the human self accomplishing these things. It is always God recognized and allowed to function without interference. Therefore, the moment prayer begins to work is not the moment you start praying. It is the moment you stop praying as a separate self and enter the silence of surrender. In this surrender, something holy takes place. The personal sense of I dissolves into the universal I am, and the infinite begins to flow without obstruction. As we move now into the next stage of this teaching, we shall see how this realization leads naturally to living from Christ consciousness, not as a fleeting experience, but as a way of life in which prayer is no longer an act, but a state of being. My beloved friends, we have journeyed together through the nature of prayer, through the silence in which God is revealed, and through the yielding of self in which grace takes over. Now we arrive at the true purpose of this entire path, not merely to pray as a practice, but to live from the consciousness in which prayer is no longer an event, but a state of being. For prayer, as Goldsmith taught, is not something we do. Prayer is what we are when we abide in the truth of oneness. Living from Christ consciousness means that every breath, every word, every act, every moment of your day flows from the awareness that God is the only life expressing as you. It does not mean you walk around in religious ecstasy. It does not mean you withdraw from the world. It does not mean you deny the ordinary tasks of human living. It means simply that you no longer live from fear, from lack, from effort, or from the old sense of me struggling to survive. You begin to move through life as transparency. The human sense of self becomes a clear window through which the divine shines. This is Christ consciousness. Let us unfold how this appears in daily life quietly, naturally, without strain. 1. Christ consciousness begins with a shift in identity. Instead of identifying yourself as a human being seeking God, you recognize yourself as the expression through which God is living its own life. You wake in the morning not with the question, "What must I accomplish today?" but with the quiet awareness, God is the activity of today. This recognition dissolves the anxiety of self-preservation. You no longer feel isolated. You no longer feel responsible for the universe. You no longer believe that life depends upon your personal effort. You become an instrument, open, receptive, yielded, and through that instrument, divine harmony begins to express. 2. You stop praying for conditions and start resting in truth. As Christ consciousness grows, you no longer pray for money, health, safety, direction. Why? Because you begin to sense, even before you see it, that supply is already flowing, health is already present, wisdom is already active, love is already completed. You do not pray for these things, you rest in their presence. And this resting is prayer. When something arises that once would have frightened you, a diagnosis, a bill, an argument, you no longer drop into panic or pleading. Instead, something within says, "Wait, let me turn inward. Let me feel the presence. Let me recognize that God is already here." And in this recognition, the fear dissolves before the condition has even changed. This is Christ consciousness in action. 3. Every encounter becomes a holy meeting. When you meet another person, family, stranger, friend, or enemy, you no longer meet their personality. You no longer react to their behavior. You no longer engage their ego. You recognize their true identity. This recognition may be silent, unnoticed by them, but it transforms the atmosphere. I behold the Christ in you. I behold the divine life expressing as you. I see beyond your appearance into your reality. In this consciousness, arguments soften, hostility dissolves, healing takes place without a word spoken. Not because you have changed the other person, but because you have refused to accept the illusion of separation. Christ consciousness reveals one self, one life, one being, appearing as many forms. 4. Work, family, and daily tasks become expressions of divine activity. Christ consciousness does not lead you away from the world, it transforms how you move within it. Your work becomes an avenue for God's intelligence. Your home becomes an atmosphere of God's peace. Your responsibilities become opportunities for God's love to flow. Your decisions become guided by a wisdom deeper than thought. You find yourself saying the right words at the right time, meeting the right people at the right moment, being led in ways impossible to explain. This is not coincidence. This is the natural outflow of living from the infinite instead of the finite. 5. Fear begins to lose its ability to dominate you. Not all at once, not perfectly, but gradually, steadily, quietly, a fear arises. And instead of collapsing into it, you turn inward. You rest in the awareness. There is only God here. Fear may still whisper, but it no longer commands your actions. Its voice fades into the background, and the presence becomes the center. This is freedom not from circumstances, but from the belief that circumstances have power. 6. You live in an atmosphere of inner peace that nothing external can alter. This peace is not produced by outer conditions. It is not dependent on everything going well. It is not fragile. It is the peace that Jesus spoke of. My peace I give unto you, not as the world giveth. This peace does not come and go. It remains. It abides. It sustains. It holds you even when appearances seem dark. And when this peace becomes your resting place, your consciousness becomes fertile ground for spiritual demonstration. 7. Prayer becomes a constant silent union, no longer reserved for moments of crisis, no longer limited to early morning or late evening, no longer dependent on words or forms. Prayer becomes a background awareness of God's presence, like the silent hum of reality sustaining every breath. You walk through the day in a state of listening. You act from quiet intuition. You speak from inner stillness. You respond from spiritual vision. This is prayer as a way of being, not as an activity. And in this state, everything you do is guided. Everything you receive is given. Everything that happens unfolds in harmony with divine order. The fruits of Christ's consciousness are inevitable. Your life begins to show forth unforced harmony, unsolicited opportunities, unexplained healings, unpredictable blessings, unshakable peace, not because you have used spiritual principles, but because you have become transparent to God. This is the life Christ consciousness brings, not dramatic, not mystical in the outer sense, but profoundly peaceful, deeply harmonious, and quietly transformative. You are no longer living life. God's life is living you. And that, my beloved friends, is When prayer ceases to be something you do and becomes the very atmosphere of your being. My beloved friends, as we bring this teaching to its gentle close, let us come again into the stillness with which we began. For everything we have touched together, every principle, every realization, every glimpse of truth has been guiding us toward one sacred awareness. The presence is already here. The kingdom is already within you. The work is already finished. Prayer does not create this presence. Prayer does not persuade this presence. Prayer does not activate this presence. Prayer reveals what has been true from the beginning. Throughout this journey, we have seen that the human approach to prayer, petition, pleading, striving, cannot reveal the activity of God because it begins with the belief that God is absent, but the spiritual approach the infinite way begins with the truth that God is the only presence, the only power, the only life, the only mind, the only reality. And from that standpoint, prayer becomes not a bridge to reach God, but a window through which we see God already present. Let us hold this in our hearts. You are not moving toward God. You are not lifting yourself to God. You are not earning God's attention. You are awakening to the truth that God has never left you. God cannot leave you. God is the very substance and life of your being. When Jesus said, "It is finished," he spoke not of the end of a life, but of the eternal completeness of God's creation. And Joel Goldsmith spent his life showing us how to live from that completion. So now, as we close, let us gently gather the essence of all we have heard. Prayer begins with stillness, not words, not effort, silence. Silence reveals oneness. I and the Father are one. Becomes not a belief, but an experience. Oneness leads to recognition. We stop asking God to change the world and begin seeing God as the reality behind the world. Recognition dissolves fear. Fear cannot survive in the presence. Fear dissolving allows grace to flow, not because we earned it, but because it was always flowing. Yielding the personal self is the turning point. When the false I steps aside, the real I am shines forth. Christ consciousness becomes a way of being. Prayer becomes life. Life becomes prayer. And now we return to the presence, not as seekers, but as those who have remembered. Let us rest in this simple, profound truth. All spiritual good is already present. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be removed. Nothing needs to be improved. Your only work is to recognize what already is. When fear arises, return to the presence. When conflict appears, return to the presence. When lack tempts you, return to the presence. When illness threatens, return to the presence. When uncertainty shakes you, return to the presence. When joy fills you, return to the presence. When peace embraces you, return to the presence. For in the presence, there is no problem and no solution. There is only God, omnipresent, omniactive, omniscient, the infinite, unfolding itself as your very life. My beloved friends, your spiritual journey does not end here. It begins anew every time you enter silence. It deepens every time you yield the personal self. It expands every time you recognize the Christ within. But the greatest truth you can carry from this moment is this: you are already one with God. You have never been otherwise. And prayer is simply the remembrance of that eternal union May you walk gently in this awareness. May you rest often in the silence. May you live from the Christ within. And may the presence reveal itself to you in every breath, every moment, every unfolding of your life. For the presence is here. The kingdom is within, and truly it is finished.